Hey, RetconRaider here. Today we're diving back into Design Document 3 one last time, as we take a look at all the little things. The subquests, the companions, the secret loot and rewards, and the other general oddities that I thought were worth mentioning. Although this is definitely one of the less complete documents, there's still a lot more information packed away in there. So, let's get started. Now, last time we talked about the main quests that the player would be confronted with upon arriving at the Boulder Dome location. But even with those quests resolved, there would still be a whole lot of subquests to keep the player busy. The Denver design document briefly mentioned that they were considering repeatable, procedurally generated side quests, so that the player would always have something to do. This is mentioned again in the Boulder Dome document, along with numerous potential repeatable quest ideas that could be randomly generated upon demand. This includes all manner of mundane or repetitive tasks. Some of them involved retrieving specific types of equipment, such as holodisks, computer parts, soil and seed samples, chemicals, schematics, energy cells, spare Pip-Boys, and even literal pieces of junk. Other quests involved recruiting new staff, such as generic mechanics or electricians. A number of the quests involved helping with maintenance around the dome, with examples including fixing jammed doors, interacting with the facility's terminals in various different ways, or repairing security equipment that had been damaged during the attacks on the facility. Some of the more ambitious repeatable quests involved sending the player out into the ruins of Denver to scout out buildings, take soil readings, retrieve blood samples from ghouls, or otherwise find various excuses to wander around the irradiated ruins looking for trouble. A number of the other side quests involved finding ways to help ZAX deal with his memory issues, usually by taking care of minor tasks so that ZAX didn't have to worry about tending to them himself. For example, a tech-minded character could find a way to help stabilize the facility's nuclear reactor, so that ZAX wouldn't have to constantly monitor it for energy fluctuations. The player could also attempt to find out what it was that ZAX was trying to calculate, though no details are given on how the player would actually be able to do this. The document also waffles a bit on exactly what ZAX is trying to calculate, pitching 3 different possibilities. The most likely possibility, since it fits the storyline, is that ZAX is trying to calculate exactly where the Bomb 2 satellite landed when it fell out of orbit years earlier. Since the crashed satellite would theoretically have information or equipment that Presper would need to infiltrate Bomb 1, it would certainly explain why the mad scientist hadn't just found a way to stop ZAX from continuing the calculation. Other things that the document mentions ZAX might be calculating includes a plague vector analysis to help calculate the spread of the new plague, as well as a calculation about how to develop a superior artificial intelligence. It's possible that ZAX was intended to be calculating all 3 of these things, and that the player was intended to be able to help resolve all 3 calculations. If the player discovered the location of Bomb 2, for example, ZAX would no longer need to calculate where it landed. Likewise, the player could theoretically render the plague vector calculation moot by curing the plague, and they could theoretically help ZAX with designing a superior form of AI by actually recovering technology from a superior AI, such as Odysseus at the Tibbetts prison facility. As I mentioned in the previous video, the player could overwrite the brains in the think tank to provide ZAX with ample new storage space, but this was generally considered evil and would not be received well by some of the dome's other inhabitants. However, the player could also find a way to instead simply loop the think tank into the facility's systems, allowing the disembodied brains to help with running various subsystems. This wouldn't fully resolve the AI's memory issues, but it would slow down the rate at which ZAX was consuming his available hard drive space. Speaking of the think tank, they would also be a potential source of some fun interactions and possible minor quests. There were about 25 brains in total, all of whom were harvested over 2 centuries ago. Most of them are at least a little insane, but mostly they're just bored, and they would ask the player to fetch them various chemicals such as Nuka-Cola or Mentats to help them pass the time. Some of the brains would even have interesting or important information that they could share with the player as a reward. One of the brains, for example, was a former employee at the nursery, and could tell the player the access code. Two of the other brains were former researchers who could give the player information about the new plague or code technology. The player could also transplant the brains into roboshell bodies if they wished, though this would have mixed results, depending on which ones they decided to transplant. Transplanting the insane soldier's brain into a robot body would probably lead to bad results, but transplanting the disembodied researchers into robo-brain shells would probably be helpful in the long run. This is presumably how the player would be able to recruit Bajar, or Brain in a Jar for short, who was one of the planned recruitable companions in Van Buren. Evil players would also be able to get some use out of the brain extracting technology. For example, the player could acquire slaves from Caesar's Legion or the Blackfoot village and then sell them to Goddard, who would harvest their brains so he could activate more maintenance robo-brains around the facility. Unscrupulous players could also harvest the brains of their companions, though they'd have to subdue or deceive their companion beforehand. This would allow the player to still effectively make use of the companion, but with the benefit of being able to reprogram them, using code technology, to prevent things like disagreements or personality clashes. Other labs or equipment around the facility could also be of potential use to enterprising players. The empty hydroponics bay, for example, could be used to grow various plants if the player or one of their companions was a suitably skilled outdoorsman. The old weapons and armor research labs could be used for crafting and maintenance, and other research labs contained experimental power armor and even particle beam research. One particularly interesting note mentions that some of the vehicles parked in the dome's garage are essentially damage-resistant mobile labs. It's barely mentioned in the document, but since we know the player would have been able to get a mobile lab in the final game, this is almost certainly where they would have found it. If the player character was smart enough, or if they could convince an NPC to help them, then they could even use some of the equipment to give themselves permanent skill or attribute bonuses. This is where the player would be able to get basic cybernetic implants that would improve their special attributes. Players could also use the facilities to learn more about computers, medicine, and science, potentially improving their skill ratings. If the character was exceptionally unintelligent, that is to say, if they were running around with an intelligence score of 1, then they could actually use the code technology in the Boulder Dome to reprogram the unused parts of their brain. This would provide marginal improvements, allowing them to inherently understand how to work with computers, and granting them a permanent +1 bonus to intelligence. Characters with appropriate science or medical skills could also spend some time researching the new plague. The player wouldn't actually be able to cure the plague here, but they would be able to discover invaluable information hidden amongst pre-war research notes. This would allow the player to study the multiple strains of the plague that had developed over the past 2 centuries. And this information could be taken to the nursery to help with devising a cure. But that's a subject for another video. One important thing the player could accomplish at the Boulder Dome was discovering how to make a nutrient paste that would temporarily suppress the infectious nature of the plague. This would allow the player to extend the game's timer by slowing the spread of the infection and reducing the damage that the player would inflict on other settlements, as long as they kept consuming a steady supply of the nutrient paste. The dome also allowed for some rather interesting interactions with the various NPCs who lived there. Goddard, for example, was arrogant and difficult to get along with, but if the player could get on his good side, he was a potential source of the rocket fuel that the player would eventually need towards the end of the game. Inquisitive players could find out important information about some of the NPCs in Denver. For example, the scientists can provide the player with tapes that prove Wagner, the ghoul tinkerer currently living with the salvagers in Denver, is actually a spy. Likewise, the players can find out a bit more about Jimmy, the super mutant medic. The various staff around Boulder Dome have mixed feelings about Jimmy, but if the player asked the jackals about the super mutant, then they would actually confirm that Jimmy is indeed a cannibal, because when they tried to attack him, he killed several of them in self-defense and then ate the corpses. And of course there was Xian. We've talked about her before, so I won't spend too much time on her. But like Badjar, she's another potential companion that the player could meet at the Boulder Dome. She didn't get along terribly well with Goddard, so she started using a secret exit to explore the countryside in her spare time. Of course, this was monumentally dangerous since she needed to wear a special environment suit to help keep her strain of the new plague under control. When Goddard activated the quarantine lockdown to seal Larson and his men outside the dome, he accidentally sealed Xian outside as well. Unable to find a way back in, she would eventually be forced to decide between suffocating when her suit's oxygen reserves ran out, or removing her suit so she could breathe, but at the cost of spreading the disease the scientists were trying to keep contained. There were a few ways the players could be pointed in Xian's direction. Goddard and some of the other scientists would mention that she was missing, but ZAX is the only one who would know about her unauthorized field trips. It's also possible that the player could accidentally stumble across her while exploring the Boulder Dome's tunnel system. Regardless of how the player found her, she would be grateful for their assistance. Aside from being a potential companion, she could also be used to research or manufacture goods for the player, and some of the concept art even implies that she might have been able to create unique bioweapons for the player to use. If the player managed to find a cure for the new plague and had sufficiently high intelligence and charisma scores, they could even strike up a romance with Xian. It was one of just 2 potential romances mentioned in the documents, and the other romance was also in the Boulder Dome. Kind or charismatic characters could strike up a rapport with Helen, though that was sure to annoy Eddie Golensky, her current boyfriend. The easiest way to win her heart was to play a low-intelligence character, because that would trigger her nurturing instinct. But more intelligent and intellectually capable characters could presumably win her over by helping out with her numerous sick or injured kids. Unfortunately, most of her kids were suffering from chronic or incurable conditions, but medically trained players could properly set broken bones, remove bullets from old wounds, and even develop proper treatment courses for some of their chronic conditions. This would not only net them some experience points, but it would also improve their reputation. Like most of the other settlements in the game, Boulder Dome was also tied heavily into the overarching trading routes quest. It would be relatively simple to re-establish basic trade between Boulder Dome and Denver. The player just had to get rid of the jackals near the dome and get rid of Bombay Jack's traps back near Denver. Then Eddie Golensky could start running supplies back and forth along the highway with his truck. More ambitious players could eventually secure a train, repair the tracks, and set up larger, more profitable supply routes. The scientists would have a number of old pre-war supplies to trade, but they would also be able to create or repair various trade goods using the salvage they would receive from Denver. They could also write books about science, medicine, and mechanics, which would be in high demand in certain settlements such as the one at Hoover Dam. The notes in the document are somewhat interesting because the list of trade goods gives us a rare glimpse at several of the items that were potentially going to make it into the final game. This includes a lot of basic items from the previous 2 games, as well as new items like gas masks, flashlights, environmental suits, pip games, the Lil Chemist chemistry kit, water purification tablets, and a wide assortment of items intended for use in the crafting system. And of course, if the player was of a more sociopathic bent, then they could find plenty of ways to ruin things for the scientists. Aside from teaming up with the jackals or Larson, the player could also steal from the scientists, or sabotage, or even outright steal Eddie Golensky's truck, though the truck was in such bad shape that it would only be usable on the highway. If the player ever tried to drive Golensky's truck off the highway, then it would immediately break down, creating a new persistent location where the player could visit the destroyed truck to store or retrieve goods. Truly amoral characters could even tell the Brotherhood of Steel about the dome, which would quickly result in the facility being seized by the Brotherhood. Unfortunately, due to their war with the NCR, they would lack the ability to repair or maintain the facility, which would almost certainly lead to the dome being rendered inoperable. And if the player decided that they were just tired of playing the game entirely, then they could freeze themselves in cryogenic storage with all the other sleepers. This would prematurely end the game, complete with its own unique ending slides. But it was unlikely to turn out well for the player. The player would survive Presper's nuclear Armageddon, but then they would almost certainly die, either because ZAX ran out of memory space and shut down, or because Presper returned to the dome to wake up the sleepers, saw the player's character, and decided to kill them in their sleep. Which leads us into our final observation about the documents. Boulder Dome is the first of the documents so far to include the rough text for the ending slides. There were 10 possible end states planned for the location. Each ending had its own narrative text, which would have presumably been voiced by Ron Perlman in the final game, as well as a description of the image slide that would have accompanied it. And that's pretty much everything. There are a few other odd notes here and there, most of which almost certainly wouldn't have made it into the final game. But that's just a testament to how the document was still being actively rewritten at the time the game was officially cancelled. A particularly interesting but very brief blurb even mentions that the developers were already thinking about designing an expansion pack for the game. But that does wrap up our analysis of Design Document 3, the Boulder Dome document. Next up, we've got Design Document 4, an 88-page document covering both the Blackfoot tribe and the Hangdog tribe. It's a pretty dense and eclectic document because the two tribes were originally supposed to be at two completely separate locations, but they were combined into a single document after the Hangdog village location was cut during early development. That means I've got a good bit of work ahead of me as I try to process all this new information and untangle it so I can turn it into a straightforward analysis of what the resulting location would have had to offer. So, for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out all 700 pages of the design documents for yourself at the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.